circumstances is to proceed with the trial nevertheless. Before we move to opening statements, I would like to welcome to this bench Judge Mustafa El-Baj, who's on my right. He has replaced Judge Gatti on the bench. And to welcome also Judge Margaret de Guzman, who's on my extreme right, appointed as the trial chamber reserve judge. I'd like to express the appreciation of the remaining members of the bench to Judge Gatti for her dedication to the Kabuga case during the pre-trial phase, and wish her well in her new capacity as president of the mechanism. With that, I now invite the prosecution to make its opening statement. Mr. Rashid.
Good morning, Your Honours. Good morning, colleagues. This case concerns Felician Kabuga and his individual responsibility for serious crimes committed during the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda between the 7th of April and 17th of July 1994. This trial starts today, 28 years after the genocide, because of Felician Kabuga's determined efforts to evade responsibility and accountability. When the genocide ended in July 1994, Kabuga fled Rwanda to neighboring Zaire. He traveled to Switzerland, where he sought and was denied asylum. Kabuga was indicted by the ICTR. Instead of surrendering to stand trial, he fled and lived as a fugitive. He remained in hiding for decades. In 2011 and 2012, the ICTR held special deposition proceedings under Mechanism Rule 78 to preserve the evidence in cases against its remaining fugitives. Witnesses testified and were cross-examined by duty counsel representing Kabuga's interests. Many of these witnesses will give evidence before the trial chamber in these proceedings. In May 2020, Kabuga was traced to a modest apartment outside Paris, where he was living under an assumed name. He was arrested and transferred to Mechanism custody in The Hague. In March 2021, the prosecution filed the operative indictment. The charges against Kabuga reflects his status as a wealthy and well-connected political insider. In support of the genocide, Kabuga did not need to wield a rifle or a machete at a roadblock. Rather, he supplied weapons in bulk and facilitated the training that prepared the Interahamwe to use them. He did not need to pick up a microphone to call for extermination of Tutsi on the radio. Rather, he founded, funded, and served as president of the Radio Télévision Libre de Mille Collines, RTLM, the radio station that broadcast genocidal propaganda across Rwanda. Kabuga is not the first businessman to face prosecution for his contributions to the most serious international crimes. There is long-standing historical precedent for prosecuting those who use their money and connections for such ends. The Nuremberg military tribunals held 3 trials charging dozens of German industrialists for participating in and supporting Nazi atrocities. Those proceedings illustrate the importance of financial and logistical support to the perpetration of large-scale crimes, even from outside the formal hierarchy of the state and its security apparatus. Kabuga's acts and conducts from at least 1992 paint a consistent picture of anti-Tutsi animus that propelled him to support the genocide. Kabuga supported the Interahamwe at the national level while establishing local groups in Kigali, at his home in Kimironko, and at a large commercial building he owned in Muhima. He led efforts to establish RTLM as a mouthpiece for anti-Tutsi propaganda, while Interahamwe were indoctrinated in similar messages on his properties. In late 1993 and early 1994, he defended RTLM's incendiary broadcasts at the ministerial level as they grew more violent toward the Tutsi and their supposed accomplices. Around the same time, Kabuga began arming his Interahamwe with the weapons they later used in the genocide. In late February or March 1994, Kabuga spoke at a rally in Musave, close to Kigali. Witness Cab 053 will testify that Kabuga was introduced as the guest of honor. He called the Tutsi the enemy and likened them to snakes, warning that if you see a snake and you don't kill that snake will bite you. He promised money, equipment, and vehicles to aid in fighting the Tutsi. Witness Cab 085 will testify that on the day of the rally, Tutsi were attacked by Interahamwe and their property was looted. Then came the genocide. On the evening of 6th April 1994, Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana was aboard an aeroplane returning from Tanzania with the President of Burundi and various senior Rwandan government officials. At around 8:30 p.m., the presidential plane was shot down near Kigali airport as it approached to land. Everyone on board was killed. In the early hours of 7th April, leading moderate politicians, mostly Hutu, from opposition political parties were systematically targeted and killed in Kigali. Groups of Rwandan Armed Forces, or RAF soldiers, and armed militias began openly killing unarmed Tutsi civilians and raping Tutsi women in their homes and in the streets. Roadblocks were erected by soldiers, Interahamwe, and other armed militia groups who checked identity cards and arrested and killed Tutsi. Roadblocks sprang up throughout Kigali and across Rwanda, at which Tutsi were identified, arrested, raped, and killed. Witnesses will describe seeing thousands of bodies strewn about, clogging public roads and waterways. As these gruesome scenes of mass murder unfolded, RTLM, Kabuga's radio station, was broadcasting urgent, enthusiastic calls to genocide, and the Interahamwe Kabuga supported were on the streets hunting down and killing Tutsi. Kabuga's support for the genocide did not waver. When RTLM's offices in Kiyovu were shelled in the middle of April 1994, Kabuga went to the scene and provided encouragement and gave financial support for the injured. He voiced RTLM's genocidal message in person at meetings, rallies, and even individual roadblocks, calling explicitly for the extermination of the enemy Tutsi. When he moved to Gisenyi, he held fundraisers to purchase weapons. He imported weapons in violation of an arms embargo. He personally appeared at roadblocks to distribute weapons and encourage the Interahamwe to accelerate the killings. When they succeeded, he congratulated and rewarded them. By 17th of July 1994, an estimated 800,000 people had been killed in just over 100 days. Hundreds of thousands were victims of rape and sexual assault. As the ICTR Appeals Chamber held in the case of Prosecutor versus Karemera, there is no reasonable basis for anyone to dispute that during 1994, there was a campaign of mass killing intended to destroy in whole, or at least in part, Rwanda's Tutsi population. The appeals chamber went on to conclude that, and I quote, "The fact of the Rwandan genocide is a part of world history, a fact as certain as any other, a classic instance of a fact of common knowledge," unquote. 28 years after the events, this trial is about holding Felician Kabuga accountable for his substantial and intentional contributions to that genocide. I will begin with a few words about Felician Kabuga, followed by an overview of the political context that set the stage for the genocide. And then Mr. Erdekin will then outline the evidence proving Kabuga's criminal responsibility, first by founding and supporting RTLM, and second by arming, training, and encouraging the Interahamwe. Felician Kabuga was born in Byumba Prefecture in northeastern Rwanda. He founded a small trading company that grew over decades into a sprawling network of business interests: a flour mill, a tea plantation, an import-export firm, factories, extensive real estate, a large fleet of trucks and commercial vehicles. By 1994, he had over $1 million in one Rwandan bank account alone. He was widely known as one of the richest men in Rwanda. You will hear in this trial from numerous witnesses that Kabuga commanded great respect among business, political, and military leaders across Rwanda. This reputation derived from both his wealth and his political connections and influence. He had an intimate relationship with President Juvenal Habyarimana, who held a monopoly over political power as chairman of the only political party permitted under the Constitution and head of states since 1973. Two of Kabuga's daughters married Habyarimana's sons. The evidence in this trial will show that Kabuga had privileged access to Habyarimana and the ability to leverage that access to promote causes and raise funds. He used that access to arrange meetings at the president's private residence and successfully lobbied Habyarimana to support both RTLM and the Interahamwe. Kabuga was an active and prominent member of Habyarimana's party, the MRND, which until 1991 was the only political party in Rwanda. He was a major financial donor. For a period in the early 1990s, the MRND headquarters was even housed in the large commercial building he had constructed, in the Muhima sector of Kigali. When a new MRND party statute was adopted in August 1991, he was among the prominent members representing Byumba Prefecture. Kabuga routinely appeared on stage at important MRND rallies with the highest party officials, including President Habyarimana and MRND Chairman Matthew Ngirumpatse. Kabuga was venerated as an august guest and major thunder of the MRND. He was introduced as a leader of the Interahamwe and given the floor to address the crowd alongside the MRND leadership. At least once, he was greeted with a standing ovation. That's a pen portrait of who Kabuga was. Now for a brief overview of the events that culminated in the genocide. In 1994, Rwanda was divided into 11 prefectures. In the geographic center was the capital, Kigali. To the northwest, bordering Zaire, was Gisenyi Prefecture. Nearly all of the crimes charged in this case took place either in Kigali, where Kabuga lived, or Gisenyi, where he spent significant time during the genocide. To Gisenyi's east, bordering Uganda, were the two other northern prefectures, Ruhengeri and Kabuga's native Byumba. South of Gisenyi was Kibuye, where crimes were also committed with Kabuga's support. Below the prefectural level were 3 administrative divisions. Prefectures were made up of communes. Communes were made up of sectors. Sectors were made up of cellules. Rwanda was also divided by ethnicity. In 1994, there were 3 principal ethnic groups. The Hutu, accounting for around 90% of the population. The Tutsi, accounting for around 9% of the population. And the Twa, accounting for around 1% of the population. Prior to independence in 1962, Rwanda was governed by a Tutsi monarchy under Belgian colonial rule. In 1959, violence broke out between Hutu and Tutsi in what became known as the Hutu Revolution. Large numbers of Tutsi fled Rwanda for neighboring countries. Post-independence, a Hutu-dominated government was in power. In 1973, a Hutu military commander from Gisenyi Prefecture named Juvenal Habyarimana staged a coup and installed himself as president of Rwanda. Habyarimana formed a political party known as the Mouvement Républicain National pour le Développement, or MRND. Rwanda became a one-party state under MRND control. Every Rwandan citizen was considered a member. The state became closely intertwined with Habyarimana, and personal connections to the president were of paramount importance. A clique of mainly Hutu northerners closest to Habyarimana and his wife Agath Kanziga, known as the Akazu, or Small House, were notorious for their influence. This was the status quo in Rwanda for nearly 2 decades. Then, in the early 1990s, 2 major developments reshaped Rwanda. The first was war. In October 1990, a military force composed primarily of Tutsi refugees from the 1959 revolution invaded Rwanda from their base in Uganda. Armed conflict broke out between the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or the RPF, and the dominated Rwandan armed forces. The government responded by depicting the war as an attempt by Tutsi forces to re-establish the pre-1959 Tutsi monarchy. Tutsi were arbitrarily arrested, and Hutu extremists unleashed a wave of anti-Tutsi sentiment that swept through parts of the majority Hutu population. It found expression in the media, in politics, and even in popular music. The second major development was the advent of multi-partyism after decades of one-party rule. In 1991, Habyarimana succumbed to pressure and amended the constitution to permit the formation of parties other than the MRND. Numerous new parties were created, including the Parti Libéral, or PL, the Mouvement Démocratique Républicain, or the MDR, and the Parti Social Démocratique, or PSD. The MRND was no longer the alter ego of the state and lost exclusive control over government assets and agencies. This included the only nationwide broadcaster, the state-owned Radio Rwanda. Suddenly, the MRND needed new sources of funding and new means to disseminate its message. It turned to the private sector, in particular a small number of wealthy Rwandans with close connections to the president. The MRND's leadership instigated the creation of a fourth major new party, the Coalition pour la Défense de la République, or CDR. The evidence in this trial will show that the CDR was established as an overtly ethnic party meant only for Hutu to protect Hutu interests. The de facto leader of the CDR, and from February 1994 its president, was a man named Jean Bosco Barayagwiza. Multi-partyism also meant that Rwandans were no longer default members of the MRND. In an effort to attract and retain members, all of the political parties established youth wings. The MRND youth wing was called the Interahamwe za MRND, or just Interahamwe. The CDR youth wing was called the Impuzamugambi. Many Interahamwe members wore a colorful uniform made of kitenge, similar to camouflage. Each youth wing held rallies and often used force to compel new members to pledge allegiance to their party. This practice became known as kubohoza. It caused outbursts of violence between the youth groups. Starting in 1992, the Interahamwe began to transform from a youth wing into an armed and trained militia. Members of the Interahamwe and other civilians began receiving military training, firearms, and traditional weapons with the support of the Rwandan army and the MRND leadership. Over the next 2 years, these two trends intensified. The anti-Tutsi sentiment and the rise of an armed and trained militia loyal to the party became gradually intertwined. The Interahamwe were indoctrinated with anti-Tutsi rhetoric, and they shifted their attention from rival youth wings and began attacking and sometimes killing Tutsi civilians and their supposed Hutu sympathizers. The case against Felician Kabuga is about his uncompromising support for both of these trends, as they escalated first to sporadic ethnic violence and ultimately to genocide. Specifically, the indictment reflects Kabuga's two major contributions to the Rwandan genocide. Firstly, through RTLM, a broadcaster of hate-filled and genocidal messages that played a vital role in priming, unleashing, and then sustaining the genocide. Kabuga founded and ran RTLM together with other leading Hutu extremists. Served as RTLM's president throughout its existence, took active steps to ensure its continued operation, and failed to use his authority to prevent further crimes. Secondly, through support for Interahamwe militia in Kigali, in Gisenyi, prior to and during the genocide. And then from mid-April 1994, he both raised funds, including via the Fonds de Défense Nationale, FDN, and he procured, imported, and distributed weapons used to attack Tutsi throughout Rwanda. This support extended to the CDR's parties, Impuzamugambi militia, and other civilians who were not formally affiliated with the MRND. For someone in Kabuga's position, with Kabuga's connections, these contributions were two sides of the same coin, the two strategies employed by the Hutu extremists to protect the status quo by denouncing and attacking Tutsi. RTLM was the propaganda machine rousing hatred and ultimately violence against the Tutsi, and the Interahamwe receptive to RTLM's rhetoric and trained, armed, and primed to execute it on the ground.
Mr. Elderkin.
Mr. President, Your Honours, thank you. First, RTLM. The dissemination of anti-Tutsi propaganda and its propensity to lead to violence were features of Rwandan history long before Kabuga and others founded RTLM in 1993. For example, with the onset of the armed conflict in October 1990, Kangura magazine warned that the bloodthirsty Tutsi were looking to impose Tutsi domination and exterminate the Hutu elite. Tutsi women married to Hutu men were said to be part of a conspiracy to introduce spies in the most influential Hutu circles. The infamous Hutu 10 Commandments claimed that Tutsi want only ethnic supremacy and derided Hutu who marry or do business with Tutsi as traitors. Hutu had to be firm and vigilant against their common Tutsi enemy. Hutu who failed to answer Kangura's call for unity against the Tutsi likewise came under attack. In 1992, the government began negotiating a peace agreement that accepted power sharing amongst the RPF and the political parties inside Rwanda. Each party, including the RPF, would have seats in the National Assembly and control over designated ministerial posts. This agreement became known as the Arusha Accords. For those dedicated to the idea of Hutu control over Rwanda and benefiting from President Habyarimana's former monopoly over power, the Arusha Accords were a sellout and a betrayal. The Accords aggravated the fear in extremist Hutu circles that the Tutsi were scheming to seize power in Rwanda, and that moderate Hutu were letting them do it. politicians perceived as moderates became targets for Kangura, for extremists, and even artists aligned to the ideology. Singer and MRND adherent Simon Bikindi wrote songs that targeted Tutsi and preached vigilance against Hutu traitors giving Rwanda away to the Tutsi. The MRND vice president in Gisenyi Prefecture, Leon Mugesera, delivered a blistering speech attacking Hutu opposition politicians and calling for the death penalty against those